All right, we'll start now. Yep. Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Ryan. Welcome to Clear the Air 2020. I'd like to give a big thank you to our three speakers for joining us today, as well as all of you for attending our first virtual panel discussion since we were founded. Should you have a question in the Q&A session, you can type your question in the Q&A tab at the bottom. As we would like to keep the conversation as open as possible, we ask that you do not publicly attribute any of the statements heard in the event today to any of the speakers or participants. Should there be any media outlets here today, we'll be happy to connect with you after the Q&A if you require any clarifications or further questions. These are unprecedented times that force many organizations like ours to think creatively on how we can continue to engage our audiences safely and effectively. We sincerely hope that all of you will remain safe and healthy in the coming months, and our hearts go out to those of us who have sacrificed in one way or another in this time of need. PM Haze is the main organizer of today's webinar. PM Haze is a charity registered in Singapore, and we are in the business of haze prevention. Since our humble beginnings in a canteen at a university, we now have an advocacy program that educates people about the root causes of haze and provides an avenue of action through the adoption and consumption of sustainable palm oil. We also have a regional program where we work with the community partners to bring people to a peat swamp forest in Malaysia to learn about sustainable development on peatland. In 2019, we have also implemented our peatland restoration program to restore degraded peatlands in Indonesia. You have the chance to learn more about our work later in the session today. Many of you are attending this session with at least one important question in mind. Will we get haze this year? I'm afraid while the question warrants a yes, no, or I don't know, the answer is often not so simple. That's why we have invited three speakers to join us in this important conversation today. The first speaker will be Ms. Meixi. Welcome, Meixi.
Thank you.
Hello. Meixi is the Assistant Director overseeing the Sustainability Program at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, or SIIA for short. The SIIA is an independent think tank covering regional and global issues. Meixi's work in the last decade has focused on designing and executing market-based solutions for creating environmental and social impact. Prior to joining the SIIA, she led multi-year programs to improve clean and sustainable energy access, financial inclusion, and gender equality in Asian and African countries. The next speaker will be Ms. Perpetua George. Welcome, Perpetua.
Thank you.
Hello. Ms. Perpetua George is the General Manager for Group Sustainability at Wilmar International Limited. Perpetua George, or PEP for short, has a career spanning work in forest conservation, sustainable production consulting, the FMCG industry, and oil palm plantations. Previously working for Unilever, ProForest, and WWF, she is currently the General Manager for Group Sustainability at Wilmar International. Her current responsibilities cover the implementation of sustainable practices in Wilmar's plantation operations and spearheading the sustainable transformation of their supply chain. She's an active participant in wider engagement with stakeholders within the partnerships and initiatives that Wilmar belongs to, such as the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, Pongo Alliance, the Tropical Forest Alliance, and the Sabah Jurisdictional Approach Steering Committee. PEP holds an MSc in Botany and Anthropology, and her research expertise is in the natural resource use of local communities, focusing on how land and different forest types are valued amongst the indigenous communities of Sabah and Malaysian Borneo. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Benjamin Tay. Welcome, Benjamin. Hello. Benjamin is the Executive Director at PM Haze, short for People's Movement to Stop Haze. He coordinates haze prevention programs both locally and overseas. PM Haze's local advocacy program includes reaching out to businesses and consumers to adopt sustainable palm oil. PM Haze also works with the Indonesian and Malaysian communities to develop and implement ecological restoration of degraded peatlands and sustainable development of community livelihoods. Benjamin first got involved in transboundary haze advocacy in 2015, as he wanted people to go beyond adaptation strategies and find solutions to prevent transboundary haze. He holds a Master of Asia Pacific Studies with distinction from the Australian National University. Behind smoke and fires, there are issues of social justice and climate resilience. He aspires to develop research on the social, cultural, and historical perspectives of social justice and climate-related advocacy in the Southeast Asian region. Now for the main event, Meixi, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Do you have my slides?
Yeah, I'm setting it up now.
Thank you. All right, cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Ryan, for the introductions. So Ryan has already introduced the SIIA, so I probably don't need to. I'll just say that the SIIA's work focuses on ASEAN as well as environmental issues affecting our region. And we have been analyzing the haze since 1997. And over the years, our work has evolved to look more closely at the forestry and resource sector. So what is the SIIA Haze Outlook? The Haze Outlook is a report that we first launched last year. It provides a risk assessment of the probability of a transboundary haze incident in Southeast Asia. And we have just launched the second annual edition of the report. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is the haze and why does it matter? So the haze is caused by forest and peat fires, mainly in Indonesia, which produces smoke as well as massive greenhouse gas emissions. The smoke causes dangers to human health, especially in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, as well as economic costs from the disruption of business. And it's also a source of geopolitical tension in the region. Fires and haze are also a major driver of climate change. So in 2015, when we had a severe haze incident, there were some estimates that said fires in Indonesia accounted for more than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions that year. So to put that in context, that's actually equal to Indonesia's total annual emissions from energy, transportation, forestry, etc. in a normal year. And that was just from the forest fires alone. So this is important to note because with COVID-19 this year, there is a danger that climate issues will fall off the radar in 2020. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Haze Outlook report provides a risk assessment for this year's fire season, but first we should look at last year. So last year, the SIIA Haze Outlook warned of a severe haze. Our amber warning was mainly due to extreme drought conditions that were expected last year. As it turned out, there was a haze event in 2019, and nearly 900,000 Indonesians had respiratory illnesses during the haze crisis, according to the Ministry of Health in Indonesia, and they were mostly in the worst hit provinces in Sumatra and Kalimantan. There was also financial costs of 5.2 billion US dollars, according to a World Bank estimate to Indonesia. Some losses are from the business closures and loss of tourism, etc., but half that loss was from the plantation sector itself. Now, despite all this, the Indonesian fires in 2019 were not as bad as the 2015 fires. It was about half the burn area and less than half the emissions of 2015. But 2019 was still a severe haze year. Next slide, please. So to put this all in context, 2019 was a year when we had major fires across the world, Indonesia, Australia, and the Amazon as well. On the chart here, you'll see the brown bars show the burn area in Indonesia, Australia, and the Amazon last year. And the green bars show the greenhouse gas emissions from each fire event. So you'll notice that the Indonesian fires affected a much smaller area. In terms of burnt area, the fires in Australia covered 13 times the area as fires in Indonesia, and the Amazon fires were over 7 times the size of Indonesian fires. However, the Indonesian fires released almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as the Australia and Amazon fires combined, and also equal to the annual total emissions of the entire country of Germany. Next slide, please. So why did the Indonesian fires release more emissions? Because nearly half of the fires were on degraded peatland. Peat soil stores a lot of carbon and it produces the thickest haze when it's burnt. So on this map that you see here, the peat areas are shaded black and you see a lot of hotspots in 2019 and in 2015 in red and yellow overlapping with the peat. Next slide, please. So our host for this event, PM Haze, shared with me a survey that they did with you guys when you sign up for this webinar. So this is one of the questions: who or what causes the haze? So it was interesting because the options that received the most votes from you were insufficient government measures and farmers using slash and burn methods. Next slide, please. So let's look at how all of those factors come into play in our Haze Outlook report. So this slide shows the framework that we use for analyzing haze risk. Our risk assessment for 2020 is that there is a moderate or amber risk of a severe transboundary haze incident. Just to be clear about a couple of things. Firstly, there will definitely be some burning on the ground in any given year. The question is how severe and whether the haze will be a transboundary incident. Secondly, this is a risk assessment, not a prediction. By putting this report out, we actually hope to provide a warning so that fire preparedness will be ramped up for the dry season. So our risk assessment is based on 3 areas: weather, including temperature and rainfall, policies and action on peat management, and people, which is human action on fire prevention and firefighting. So I'll first describe the key factors in our assessment for each of the 3 areas briefly, and I'll go into more detail later on. For weather, this year's conditions are predicted to be neutral and better than last year, and it doesn't seem that we are expecting severe drought conditions this year. On peat management, some NGOs have been concerned about certain environmental regulations, but on balance, we think there are positive signals from the Indonesian authorities. And also the largest companies have been continuing their sustainability commitments even during the COVID crisis. But the people factor is the biggest unknown this year. There are 2 issues. Firstly, while the major business groups have sustainability policies in place, there are some questions about the middle-sized players who are more difficult to monitor and engage with than the large companies. Secondly, COVID-19 has already disrupted the fire and haze prevention on the ground, and there are also potential longer-term market effects from the economic slowdown caused by the pandemic. Next slide, please. So now I'll give a bit more detail on the 3 key factors. On the weather, part of the reason that the 2019 fires were so severe in Indonesia as well as Australia was the Indian Ocean Dipole, or IOD. IOD causes differences in sea surface temperatures in different parts of the Indian Ocean, which then affects rainfall. So last year we had a record positive IOD, which means that less rainfall we had less rainfall in our region. The El Nino phenomenon, or ENSO, which you might be familiar with, is a similar phenomenon, but in the Pacific Ocean. So just to point out on the chart here, if you look at the areas circled in red, these are peaks for either El Nino or IOD in 1997, 2015, and 2019, which were all years when we experienced severe haze in Southeast Asia. Now, the good news this year is that ENSO and IOD have been muted for the first half of the year, and they are likely to remain so going forward. And some are even saying that we may see higher rainfall for our region this year. Next slide, please. So rainfall predictions do vary quite a bit, but we see most projections suggesting normal or higher than average rainfall for the region. The chart here shows that the first few months of 2020 had higher than average rainfall, and if that continues, it will be a wetter year overall. So in summary, dry weather is less of a concern in 2020. So we need to look at human factors or actions by the government and by companies. Next slide, please. In terms of policy action, the Indonesian authorities are taking the haze quite seriously and they don't want a repeat of 2019. Indonesia has had a moratorium on new commercial licenses on primary forest and peatland since 2011, which has been extended a few times. And President Jokowi made the moratoriums permanent in August 2019. There is also a separate 3-year moratorium in place for 2018, from 2018 for the palm oil industry. No new licenses and no concession expansion is allowed. Secondly, Jokowi established the Peatland Restoration Agency, or BRG, in 2016 to restore degraded peatland. Now, BRG did most of its work on public land in the first 2 years, but half of its targeted area is actually in private sector concessions, meaning that companies instead of the BRG have to do most of the work. Only about 18% of the area within concessions had been restored as of early 2019. Another thing to note about BRG is that its mandate ends this year. Unfortunately, its future beyond 2020 is still unclear. There have been media reports that the president is going to renew the mandate, but there is no official announcement or law so far. Finally, although there are overall positive signals from Indonesian authorities on sustainability, NGOs are concerned that certain environmental regulations are being loosened. For example, in 2019, before the Haze, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry relaxed guidelines for the protection of peat landscapes. And some experts actually observed that during the subsequent fire season, there were fires in areas that were no longer protected after the policy change. And there's also the Omnibus Bill, which Jokowi's government is trying to push through. This has some positive implications for sustainability, such as streamlining licenses for companies that want to conduct ecosystem restoration or to sell carbon credits generated by those activities, for example. But other aspects of the Omnibus Bill are controversial. Some people say that it will reduce liability for companies for fires in their concessions, and that it will scrap a requirement for companies to allocate land to plasma smallholders, which basically means that it's a disincentive for companies to work with smallholders to improve sustainability. Next slide, please. So even if some of the policy moves by the Indonesian government have been controversial, overall, they did seem to have a positive effect. 2019, although it was a bad Haze year, it was not as bad as 2015. And in 2017, Indonesia actually set a national target to halve the number of hotspots compared to 2015. And although the 2019 fires were bad, Indonesia actually did achieve this goal. There were fewer hotspots and less emissions in 2019 than in 2015. Next slide, please. So moving on to private sector action, we see that most large companies are committed to sustainability, as I mentioned before. The major firms are members of industry bodies like the RSPO, and they have made sustainability commitments. Of course, not doing so would bring reputational risk to these international companies. However, there are concerns about the medium-sized companies in the sector, some of whom may supply the larger firms. And here I'm referring not to smallholders, but to companies that do have scale, but they don't have international visibility, and they don't have membership in industry groups that promote sustainability, such as the RSPO. And unfortunately, it is quite difficult to engage with these firms which have little public presence and are not members of industry bodies. It is also difficult to exclude them from the supply chain completely, especially in the palm oil sector where there are many small and medium-sized suppliers. So all the major firms that we talked to while putting together this report are working with their suppliers to improve sustainability and cooperating with NGOs to do so. But it is still a very big challenge. Finally, 2019 was a bad year for palm oil prices. And now with COVID-19 and the economic downturn, the industry is searching for incentives to improve sustainability. And this ties into a general issue that we have had for a long time in sustainability, which is that the price premium for certified sustainable products is too small to act as an incentive oftentimes. Next slide, please. So moving on to COVID-19, which has had a major impact on the human drivers of the haze, such as fire prevention and response. In terms of cost, pandemic response has taken up resources that might also be needed for haze response. And in April, the Indonesian Ministry of Environment and Forestry had its 2020 budget slashed by 17%. And beyond finances, COVID-19 has also strained healthcare systems. And if we get a haze incident later this year, that would cause further strain on our healthcare systems. COVID-19 also affects bandwidth because currently authorities are rightly focusing on the pandemic and figuring out how to deal with easing of lockdowns gradually and safely. So less capacity is available to prevent illegal forest encroachment and burning. We've actually heard anecdotal evidence that the encroachment has increased during this period. And finally, COVID-19 movement restrictions have interrupted work in ecosystem restoration, fire response, certification and audits, as well as in-person engagement of communities on fire prevention. And it's not clear yet when the activities will be able to fully resume. Next slide, please. So what I covered in the previous slide were ways that COVID-19 has already impacted fire prevention on the ground. But there is still a question about the longer term economic impact of COVID-19 and how that affects sustainability. So I mentioned earlier that palm oil prices in 2019 were low in general. Towards the end of 2019, there was a bit of a spike. However, these gains have now been erased by COVID-19. Some experts have said that because of this, there will be less burning. When the market is bad, a company may hold on rather than trying to clear land to expand their operations. But some experts say that a prolonged downturn may, in fact, reduce private sector funding for sustainability in the longer term. Once again, I want to say here that the concern is not really the major companies. They do have the scale and the resilience to ride out the crisis. And in general, plantations are also a long cycle business. The danger really is the mid-sized growers that have lower margins. They may be more heavily affected by the crisis, and they may see the need to continue land clearing, and they may even resort to slash and burn practices to save cost. So the jury is still out on this one. The longer the downturn persists, the greater the risk that sustainability will be on the back burner. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I just want to repeat what I said before, that the amber warning of this haze outlook is not a prediction. We would love to be proven wrong. Instead, we want it to be a call to action. COVID-19, as we all know, is a serious public health challenge, but we also must not forget about the environment while we are dealing with the pandemic. There is a real danger of a haze crisis happening while we are still fighting COVID-19. And this would definitely stretch the economic resources and healthcare systems even more than they already are. And if we have business and school closures because of the haze, that will further damage economies. So our hope is with this report that all stakeholders, governments, NGOs, and companies can work to prevent this. So that's all I have. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions later.